A millionaire finds a woman crying in the street and discovers that she was abandoned with nothing but her clothes. The rain fell relentlessly on the streets of Guanajuato, a colonial city in the heart of Mexico. The drops hit the pavement hard, creating a gray blanket that blurred the outlines of the centuries-old buildings. In the midst of this deluge, a luxurious black automobile drove slowly through the cobblestone streets. Inside the vehicle, Emiliano Montero, a 55-year-old businessman, was absently observing the urban landscape through the fogged-up window. His face, marked by years and success, reflected a mixture of weariness and melancholy. He wore an impeccable suit that contrasted with the dreary atmosphere outside. "Sir, would you like me to take you directly to the mansion?" the chauffeur asked, breaking the silence. Emiliano took a few seconds to answer, as if the question had brought him out of a trance. "No, Joaquin. Let's take one more ride downtown. I'm in no hurry to get home." The driver nodded and continued the ride. Emiliano turned his attention back to the window, lost in thought. Despite his fortune and influence in the business world, he felt inexplicably empty. The meetings, the million-dollar contracts, and the high society parties no longer filled the emptiness he felt inside. Suddenly, something caught his attention. At a bus stop, under a tin roof that barely protected her from the rain, she saw a young woman. She was sitting on the bench, her head in her hands, her body shaking in what seemed to be silent sobs. "Joaquin, stop the car," Emiliano ordered, feeling an inexplicable urgency. The driver obeyed, pulling over next to the stop. Emiliano rolled down the window, letting some raindrops enter the vehicle. "Señorita," he called in a soft but firm voice, "are you all right?" The young woman looked up surprised. Her eyes, a deep honey color, were reddened from crying. Her black hair, soaked with rain, clung to her pale face. She was wearing simple but elegant clothes, a navy blue dress and a beige sweater that was now wet and disheveled. I'm fine," she replied in a shaky voice, trying to smile without success. Emiliano felt a pang in his chest. There was something about that young woman, in her sad look and dejected posture, that moved him deeply. "Let me help you," he said, opening the car door. "It's terrible weather. I can take you wherever you need to go." The young woman hesitated for a moment, looking alternately at Emiliano and at the empty road where the bus should be coming. "I wouldn't want to disturb," she began. "No bother at all," Emiliano insisted with a gentle smile. "Please come in. I can't leave you here in this storm." After a few seconds that seemed eternal, the young woman nodded and got up. With hesitant steps, she approached the car and climbed in. "Thank you," she murmured as she settled into the leather seat. "I'm Emiliano Montero," he introduced himself, offering her a silk handkerchief that he took out of his jacket pocket. "Jimena Saldivar," she replied, accepting the handkerchief with trembling hands. "How do you do, Jimena? Where are you headed?" The young woman lowered her gaze, twisting the handkerchief between her fingers. "The truth is, I have nowhere to go. I just got into town and—" Her voice broke and new tears threatened to well up in her eyes. Emiliano felt something stir inside him. A compassion he had not experienced in years came over him. "In that case," he said in a warm voice, "I invite you to my house. You can dry off, eat something warm and rest. Then, if you wish, I'll help you find a place to stay." Jimena looked at him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Would you do that for me? You don't even know me." "Sometimes," Emiliano replied with an enigmatic smile. "Fate puts us in the path of those who need help. And today, it seems that fate has brought us together." With those words, he motioned for Joaquin to put the car in gear. As the vehicle pulled away from the bus stop, Emiliano couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter would change his life forever. What he didn't know was how profound and turbulent that change would be. The Montero mansion stood majestically on the outskirts of Guanajuato, an imposing colonial structure that blended traditional Mexican architecture with modern touches. Surrounded by lush gardens and protected by high walls, it was an oasis of luxury and privacy. As the car drove through the massive wrought iron gates, Jimena could not contain an exclamation of astonishment. Her eyes, still red from crying, widened at the sight of the opulent residence. Breathtaking, she murmured, as the vehicle pulled up in front of the main entrance. Emiliano smiled, pleased by the young woman's reaction. Welcome to my home, Jimena. I hope you can find the shelter you need here. As they got out of the car, they were greeted by Dolores, the housekeeper, a woman in her 60s with a kind face but sharp eyes, who had been in the service of the Montero family for decades. Don Emiliano, she greeted with a slight nod, then turned her inquisitive gaze to Jimena. Dolores, please prepare the guest room, Emiliano ordered. Miss Jimena will be staying with us for a while. If the housekeeper was surprised by this sudden decision, she did not show it. With a simple, "Yes, sir," she withdrew to comply with the order. Emiliano led Jimena inside the mansion. The young woman couldn't help but marvel at the high ceilings, the paintings by famous artists that adorned the walls, and the furniture that looked like something out of a museum. You must be exhausted and soaking wet, Emiliano commented. Dolores will show you to your room. There is a private bathroom where you can take a hot shower. I'll lend you some of my daughter's, well, my ex-wife's. She must have left some clothes that might fit you. Jimena nodded, grateful. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Montero. Your kindness is— Please call me Emiliano, he interrupted her with a warm smile. And you have nothing to thank. As I told you, sometimes fate puts us on the right path. Dolores returned and led Jimena to her room. Once alone, the young woman allowed herself to relax for the first time in what seemed like days. She took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away not only the rain, but also some of the tension she carried. Meanwhile, Emiliano retired to his study. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in front of the lit fireplace, lost in thought. What had prompted him to help this stranger? Why did he feel this strange connection with her? Hours later, when Jimena came down for dinner, Emiliano was impressed. Dressed in a simple white dress that had belonged to his ex-wife, with black hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, the young woman seemed transformed. She was no longer the dejected creature from the bus stop, but a beautiful and enigmatic woman. Dinner passed in an atmosphere of mutual curiosity. Emiliano discovered that Jimena was 25 years old and originally from Mérida, Yucatan. She had come to Guanajuato in search of a new beginning, although she was evasive about the exact reasons for her trip. And what brings you to Guanajuato specifically? Asked Emiliano, intrigued. Jimena looked down at her plate as if searching for the right words. I'm looking for answers. About my past. About my family. Your family? Emiliano felt a twinge of interest. You have no contact with them? My mother passed away recently, Jimena answered in a soft voice. And my father, well, I never knew him. But I have reason to believe he might be here, in Guanajuato. Emiliano felt a strange mix of empathy and curiosity. I'm sorry about your mother, and I hope you find the answers you seek. The conversation continued, flowing with a naturalness that surprised them both. They talked about books, about music, about their favorite places in Mexico. Emiliano found himself fascinated by Jimena's intelligence and sensitivity, while she seemed genuinely interested in his stories about business and travel. As the evening progressed, Emiliano could not shake the sense of familiarity he felt with Jimena. There was something in her gestures, in the way she tilted her head as she listened attentively, that reminded him of someone. But he could not identify who. When they finally retired to rest, Emiliano found himself tossing and turning in his bed, unable to fall asleep. Jimena's presence in his house had awakened emotions he thought he had forgotten. He felt an inexplicable need to protect her, to help her in her search. In the guest room, Jimena was also awake. She was looking out the window at the moonlit gardens, with an indecipherable expression on her face. She pulled a crumpled photograph from her purse. In it, a young woman smiled at the camera, hugging a man whose face had been cropped out. Mom, Jimena whispered, caressing the image tenderly. I'm close. Soon I'll know the truth. With that silent promise, she put the picture away and settled down to sleep. Tomorrow would be another day, another step in their mysterious mission. What neither of them knew was that their fates were intertwined in a way neither could imagine, and that the days ahead would bring revelations that would change their lives forever. The next few days passed in a strange but pleasant routine. Jimena, who had initially planned to stay only one night, found herself extending her stay at the Montero mansion. Emiliano, for his part, seemed delighted with her presence, putting off business trips and spending more time at home than he had in years. One morning, as they ate breakfast on the terrace overlooking the gardens, Emiliano could no longer contain his curiosity. "Jimena," he began, in a casual tone that didn't quite manage to hide his interest. "You mentioned you're looking for your father. May I ask what makes you think he's in Guanajuato?" The young woman set her coffee cup down on the table, her gaze losing itself in the horizon for a moment before answering. "My mother," she finally said. "Before she died, she told me a story of youthful love, with a man from Guanajuato. She never mentioned his name, but she said he was from a prominent family here." Emiliano felt a shiver run down his spine. "And you don't have any more clues, any photos, any souvenirs?" Jimena shook her head. "I only know that they met in Merida about 26 years ago. He was there on business. They had a brief but intense affair. By the time my mother found out she was pregnant, he had already left, without a trace." The businessman paled slightly but managed to keep his composure. His mind was working at full speed, connecting dates and memories. "It must be difficult," he commented, trying to make his voice sound normal, searching for someone with so little information. "It is," Jimena admitted with a sad smile, "but I feel like I'm close. There's something about this city, this house even, that makes me feel like I'm on the right path." Emiliano nodded, distracted. His mind traveled back 26 years to a business trip to Merida. He remembered a beautiful young woman, with honey-colored eyes, much like Jimena's. A fleeting, passionate romance that had ended abruptly when he had to return to Guanajuato. He never knew what had become of her. "Emiliano," Jimena's voice brought him out of his thoughts. "Are you all right? You've been very quiet." Yeah, he replied, forcing a smile. "I was just thinking about how difficult this search must be for you. If I can help you with anything, please let me know." Jimena smiled back, an expression of gratitude lighting up her face. "You've already done so much for me, Emiliano. Your hospitality, your kindness. It means more than I can express." The rest of the day passed with an underlying tension, at least for Emiliano. Every gesture, every word from Jimena now took on new meaning. The way she tilted her head when she was pensive, the glint of determination in her eyes, even her laugh. Everything reminded him of that young woman from Merida. That night, locked in his study, Emiliano pulled out an old box of mementos he kept in his safe. Among yellowed papers and faded photographs, he found what he was looking for, an image of him, 26 years younger, embracing a woman on a Yucatan beach. Her face was partially hidden, but her eyes, those honey-colored eyes, were unmistakable. With trembling hands, Emiliano dropped the photograph on his desk. The possibility that had been hovering in his mind since he first met Jimena now seemed both a terrifying and thrilling certainty. Could it be? He muttered to himself. Could Jimena be? He didn't dare complete the sentence, but the question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Meanwhile, in her room, Jimena was also immersed in her own thoughts. Sitting in front of the mirror, she was brushing her long black hair, a ritual she used to share with her mother. She remembered her mother's last words to her before she died. "Your father, my girl, is a powerful man from Guanajuato. Seek him out, but be careful. Power sometimes hardens the heart." Jimena put down the brush and stared at her reflection. "I'm close, Mama," she whispered. "I can feel it." The next few days were marked by a strange dance of closeness and estrangement between Emiliano and Jimena. He, torn between the desire to know the truth and the fear of the consequences. She, increasingly convinced that her search was coming to an end, but unsure of how to proceed. One afternoon, as they strolled through the gardens of the mansion, Emiliano finally mustered the courage to broach the subject that was tormenting him. "Jimena," he began, his voice barely a whisper, There is something I must ask you. It's about your mother. What was her name? The young woman looked at him, surprised by the question. Sofia, she answered. Sofia Valverde. Why do you ask? Emiliano felt the world stop. Sofia Valverde. The name he had tried to forget for more than 2 decades was now coming back into his life with the force of a hurricane. I met a Sofia Valverde in Merida many years ago, she confessed, her voice cracking with emotion. Jimena's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and realization flooding her face. Emiliano, she said slowly, are you saying that you... Before she could finish the sentence, they were interrupted by the hurried arrival of Dolores, the housekeeper. Don Emiliano, the woman said breathlessly, you have an urgent call in your study. It's his lawyer, he says it's about the will. Emiliano, still stunned by the revelation he was about to make, nodded mechanically. Excuse me, Jimena, I have to attend to this. But this conversation is not over. As Emiliano walked away toward the house, Jimena remained in the garden, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. Could it be true? Could this man, who had taken her in so kindly, be the father she never knew? What neither of them knew was that this revelation was only the beginning. The secrets that were yet to be uncovered would shake the foundations of their lives and test the bonds they were beginning to form. Emiliano hurried into his study, closing the door behind him. With trembling hands, he picked up the telephone receiver. Gustavo? He asked, recognizing his lawyer's voice on the other end of the line. What's so urgent? Emiliano, my friend, Gustavo replied, his tone serious. I've been reviewing your will as you asked me to do last week. Well, there's something you should know. The businessman dropped into his leather armchair, suddenly exhausted. What's it about? There's a clause, Gustavo explained, one that was apparently added more than 2 decades ago. It states that, should an unknown heir appear, he would be entitled to a substantial part of your fortune. Emiliano felt the air leave his lungs. What? But how is it possible? I don't remember adding such a clause. It was shortly after your trip to Merida, the lawyer continued. Do you remember? You came to my office quite upset. You insisted that we add this clause, although you never told me why. Memories flooded Emiliano's mind. That trip to Merida, Sofia, the guilt that had tormented him for years. Gustavo, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I think that unknown heir just showed up. Meanwhile, in the garden, Jimena was fighting a whirlwind of emotions. The possibility that Emiliano was her father filled her with a mixture of hope and fear. How would he react? What would this mean for their relationship? Lost in thought, she didn't notice Dolores's presence until the housekeeper was at her side. Miss Jimena, the older woman said, her voice laden with an emotion the young woman didn't know how to interpret. There is something you should know. Jimena looked at Dolores, intrigued by the seriousness of her tone. What is it, Dolores? I have served the Montero family for decades, Dolores began, her eyes fixed on a distant point. I've seen many things, kept many secrets, but there is one that I can no longer keep quiet. Jimena's heart began to pound. What are you talking about? 26 years ago, Dolores continued, Don Emiliano returned from a trip to Merida. He was changed, sad, worried. One night I overheard him talking on the phone. He mentioned a woman named Sofia. And a baby. Jimena felt the world stop. My mother, she whispered. He was talking about my mother and me. Dolores nodded, her eyes now fixed on Jimena. From the moment I saw you arrive, I knew who you were. You have the same eyes as the woman in the photograph Don Emiliano keeps in his study. The young woman staggered, overwhelmed by the revelation. Dolores held her up, guiding her to a nearby bench. Why are you telling me this now? Asked Jimena, once she managed to catch her breath. Because I see how Don Emiliano looks at her, Dolores replied. I see the affection, the recognition in his eyes, and I fear that if he doesn't know the whole truth, they could both get hurt. The whole truth? repeated Jimena, sensing there was more to discover. What else is there, Dolores? The housekeeper took a deep breath before continuing. Don Emiliano never knew Sofia was pregnant. She tried to contact him, but what? Insisted Jimena, seeing that Dolores hesitated. But someone intercepted the letters, the calls. Someone who thought he was protecting the future of the Montero family. Jimena felt her blood run cold in her veins. Who would do something like that? Don Emiliano's mother, Dolores revealed, her voice barely a whisper. Doña Consuelo. She believed that a woman from Mérida without fortune or connections was not suitable for her son. So she made sure Emiliano never knew about you. The revelation fell on Jimena like a bucket of cold water. Everything she had believed, everything her mother had told her, suddenly took on new meaning. So, she said slowly, processing the information, Emiliano never abandoned us. He simply didn't know of my existence. Dolores nodded, her eyes full of compassion. Don Emiliano is a good man, Miss Jimena. He has carried guilt that is not his due for all these years. At that moment, the door to the study opened, and Emiliano stepped out, his face pale and shocked. Seeing Jimena and Dolores in the garden, he walked toward them with hesitant steps. Jimena, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. There is something I must tell you, something I've just discovered. The young woman stood up, facing the man she now knew was her father. And I have something to tell you, Emiliano, she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. They both looked at each other, aware that they were on the verge of a revelation that would change their lives forever. The air seemed charged with electricity, and time seemed to stand still as father and daughter prepared to face the truth they had sought for so long. What neither knew was that this revelation would not be the end of their story, but only the beginning of a journey that would test family ties, forgiveness, and love's ability to heal old wounds. Emiliano's study, normally a sanctuary of calm and reflection, now seemed charged with palpable tension. Emiliano and Jimena sat across from each other, separated by the imposing mahogany desk, but united by a bond they were just beginning to understand. Jimena, Emiliano began, his voice trembling. I think I am your father. Even though she already suspected as much, hearing those words from Emiliano's mouth made Jimena feel a lump in her throat. I know, she replied softly. Dolores told me everything. Emiliano looked in surprise toward the housekeeper who remained standing near the door, her face a mask of serene determination. Forgive me, Don Emiliano, Dolores said. But it was time for the truth to come out. The businessman nodded slowly, grateful for the intervention of his faithful employee. Then he turned his attention back to Jimena. I never knew, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. I never knew Sofia was pregnant. If I had known... I know, Jimena interrupted, surprising Emiliano with the understanding in her voice. I know you didn't abandon us willingly. Dolores told me about your mother. Emiliano blanched. My mother? What does she have to do with all this? Jimena related to him what Dolores had revealed to her. How Doña Consuelo had intercepted Sofia's communications. How she had kept Emiliano in ignorance about her daughter's existence. As Jimena spoke, Emiliano felt the world crumbling around him. Years of guilt, of regret, of unanswered questions. Everything took on a new and painful meaning. I can't believe it, he murmured, sinking his face into his hands. All these years, how could he do something like this? Jimena, moved by an impulse she didn't quite understand, stood up and rounded the desk. Gently, she placed a hand on Emiliano's shoulder. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. Nor yours, nor my mother's. Emiliano looked up, his tear-filled eyes meeting Jimena's. At that moment, something snapped inside him. Years of repressed emotions came to the surface, and before he could contain himself, he was sobbing. Jimena, surprised by this display of vulnerability from the man she had come to know as strong and determined, did not hesitate to embrace him. For a long moment, father and daughter remained like that, united in an embrace that seemed to want to make up for decades of absence. When they finally parted, both had reddened eyes, but a new light shone in them. A light of understanding, of forgiveness, of hope. "There is so much I want to know," Emiliano said, regaining his composure. "So much I want to tell you, but first I need to do something." He got up and walked to the safe hidden behind a painting. With trembling hands, he opened it and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "This is my will," he explained, returning to the desk. "Years ago, I added a clause, one that guaranteed a portion of my fortune to an unknown potential heir. I think deep down, I always knew there was something else. Something I didn't remember or didn't want to face." Jimena looked at him, surprised. "Emiliano, I didn't come for money, I just wanted—" "I know," he interrupted her with a soft smile. "And that only confirms to me that you are worthy of your mother's daughter. Sophia wasn't interested in my fortune either. But this isn't about money, Jimena. It's about recognition. About doing things right, even if it's late." She picked up a pen and with determination signed the document. "Now it's official. You are my heir, recognized before the law and before the world." Jimena felt tears returning to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "But more than your heiress, I would like to be your daughter." Emiliano felt his heart skip a beat. "Nothing would make me happier," he replied, his voice charged with emotion. The moment was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Dolores entered, carrying a tray of tea and cookies. "I thought you might need something," the housekeeper said with a warm smile. As Dolores poured the tea, Emiliano and Jimena began to talk. They talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, dreams, and hopes. Emiliano told of his relationship with Sophia, how they had met, how he had fallen madly in love with her that summer in Merida. Jimena, for her part, shared anecdotes of her childhood, of her mother's sacrifices, of how she had always felt that a part of her was incomplete. As the evening progressed, they both felt they were making up for lost time. But they were also aware that they had a long road ahead of them. There were wounds to heal, trust to build, a relationship to forge. "There's something else you need to know," Jimena said as the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning. "When I came to Guanajuato, it wasn't just to find you. I also came, I came with the intention of getting revenge." Emiliano looked at her, surprised but not judgmental. "Avenge you?" Jimena nodded, embarrassed. "I thought you had abandoned us, that you had left my mother alone and pregnant. I wanted to destroy your reputation, ruin your life like I thought you had ruined ours." A heavy silence fell over the room. Emiliano processed this new information, while Jimena held her breath, fearing she had destroyed the fragile connection they had formed. Finally, Emiliano spoke. "I understand," he said softly, "and I can't blame you for those feelings. In your place, I probably would have felt the same." Jimena looked at him, amazed at his understanding. "You're not angry?" "How could I be?" replied Emiliano with a sad smile. "I have made many mistakes in my life, Jimena. And although I wasn't aware of it, the biggest one was not being there for you and your mother. If anyone has a right to be angry, it's you." Jimena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "Now that I know the truth, that I know you, I just want to look forward." Emiliano extended his hand on the desk and Jimena took it without hesitation. "Then let's look forward together," he said. At that moment, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, illuminating the studio with a golden light, father and daughter felt they were on the verge of a new beginning. A beginning filled with challenges, to be sure, but also with hope, love, and the promise of a shared future. What they didn't know was that this new beginning would bring with it challenges that would test their newfound relationship, and that the past still had some surprises in store for them. The days following the revelation passed in a kind of emotional haze for Emiliano and Jimena. The Montero mansion, once a symbol of Emiliano's loneliness and empty success, now vibrated with a new energy, filled with conversation, laughter, and occasionally shared tears. Emiliano canceled all his business commitments, devoting every moment to getting to know the daughter he never knew he had. Jimena, for her part, called her friends in Mérida, explaining that her stay in Guanajuato would be extended indefinitely. One morning, as they ate breakfast on the terrace, Emiliano broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Jimena," he began with a certain hesitation in his voice, "I've been thinking. Would you like us to make our kinship public?" Jimena looked at him surprised. "Public? You mean—" "To announce it officially," Emiliano confirmed. "A press conference, perhaps. I want the world to know that you are my daughter, that you are part of the Montero family." The young woman was silent for a moment, processing the proposal. "It's a big step," she finally said. "Are you sure?" Emiliano nodded firmly. "Completely. I've lived too long hiding my emotions, Jimena. I don't want to hide the happiness I feel at having found you." Jimena felt a surge of emotion at these words, but there was still a shadow of doubt in her eyes. "And what about your reputation? Of the company? I'm an unknown suddenly appearing. People will talk." "Let them talk," Emiliano replied with a defiant smile. "I've spent too many years worrying about what others think. Now I only care about what you think. What do you say?" After a moment of reflection, Jimena nodded, a smile lighting up her face. "Let's do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Emiliano contacted his PR team, carefully preparing the announcement. Jimena, meanwhile, found herself immersed in a world she was just beginning to understand, that of Guanajuato high society. Dolores, ever attentive, became an invaluable ally to Jimena, guiding her through the intricate social protocols and helping her prepare for the public scrutiny that was inevitably to come. Finally, the day of the press conference arrived. The main hall of the Montero mansion was filled with journalists and prominent figures of Guanajuato society, all eager to discover the reason for such a sudden summons. Emiliano, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, stood in front of the microphones. Beside him, Jimena glowed in an elegant blue dress, her nervousness barely perceptible under a facade of serenity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emiliano began, his voice firm and clear, "I have summoned you today to share with you a piece of news that has changed my life in the most wonderful way possible." He paused, his eyes meeting Jimena's for a brief moment before continuing. "A few weeks ago, fate put an extraordinary young woman in my path. What began as an act of kindness to a stranger has become the most important reunion of my life." He took a deep breath before blurting out the news that would change everything. "Jimena Saldivar, who you see here beside me, is my daughter." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the room. Camera flashes illuminated Jimena's face, who maintained her composure despite the surge of emotions that swept over her. "I know this comes as a surprise to many," Emiliano continued, "and I understand that there will be questions, speculation, but the truth is simple. 26 years ago, I made the mistake of walking away from the woman I loved, not knowing that she was expecting my child. Today, fate has given me the opportunity to make amends for that mistake, to meet the daughter I never knew I had." Jimena stepped forward, taking the microphone. Her voice, though soft, was full of determination. "I came to Guanajuato looking for answers about my past, about my origin. What I found was much more than I ever imagined. A father, a family, a home." The press conference went on for hours, with Emiliano and Jimena answering questions, sharing anecdotes of their reunion, and expressing their desire to build a future together. When it was finally over, and the last journalists left the mansion, Emiliano and Jimena retired to the studio, exhausted, but with a sense of accomplishment. "We did it," Jimena said, dropping into one of the armchairs. Emiliano nodded, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "We did it, how do you feel?" "Overwhelmed," she admitted, "but also liberated, like I could finally be myself, no secrets, no doubts." Emiliano sat down next to her, taking her hand. "I know it won't be easy. There will be those who doubt, those who question. But we will face everything together, as a family." Jimena squeezed his hand, grateful for the support. "As a family," she repeated. At that moment, Dolores entered the study, her normally serene face showing signs of concern. Don Emiliano, Miss Jimena, she said, her voice tense. There is someone to see you. He says it's urgent. Who is it? Asked Emiliano, intrigued by Dolores's expression. The housekeeper took a deep breath before answering. It's Doña Consuelo, their mother. She just arrived from Mexico City, and she's not alone. Emiliano and Jimena exchanged looks of surprise and apprehension. The unexpected arrival of Doña Consuelo, the woman who had kept this family apart for so many years, promised to bring new challenges and revelations. Send her in, Emiliano finally said, his voice firm despite the tension evident on his face. As they waited, Jimena felt a mixture of emotions: curiosity to meet the woman who was her grandmother, fear for the consequences this visit might bring, and a fierce determination to protect the relationship she had just begun to build with her father. What none of them knew was that Doña Consuelo's arrival would mark the beginning of a new stage in their family history, one that would test the newly formed bonds and reveal secrets that had remained hidden for decades. When the door to the study opened again, Emiliano and Jimena stood up, preparing to face whatever fate had in store for them. Past and present were about to collide, and the future of the Montero family hung in the balance.